What I want to start by saying is I miss you guys, and teaching like this is just not the same as being with you and being present with you and taking your questions and getting to talk to you every day. So I hope that you and your families are doing well, and I hope that everything's going smoothly during this really challenging time. So I want to make sure that you understand that the reason why I'm making these videos is so that you feel like you're in class and you're getting a lecture and you're able to get some of that information that I provide you without necessarily providing it on the slide itself. So please tune in. The three goals of the New Deal were relief, recovery, and reform. What I'd like you to do is to be able to match those four agencies with what the goals were and how they wanted to reach those goals. So I'm going to use an example. I'm going to use one of the ones that isn't one of the four. The one that I'm going to use as the example is the Emergency Banking Relief Act and the Banking Act. Was there a relief goal? Was there a recovery goal? Yes. To ensure that banks would be able to financially recover and people would be able to recover the lost funds. The last is reform. The FDIC is an example of reform because it is going to provide a new way moving forward to create federal insurance on your deposits. So as you're thinking about what do I need to get out of this lecture today, you need to be able to identify those three goals: relief, reform, recovery, and apply that to four of these agencies that we're going to look at today. The four agencies that you need to be paying special attention to are the AAA, the CCC, the NIRA, and the FSA, which is actually the FLSA. And I will give you a specific note of where to make that change. So as you are tuning into this lecture today, make sure that you are paying special attention to these ideas of recovery, relief, and reform. When we get into our assessment tomorrow, you are going to be looking at a contemporary issue. You're going to be looking at a secondary source that draws comparisons between today's market in the light of the coronavirus and the Great Depression. So keep that in mind. Make sure you are paying attention to relief, recovery, reform, and these four key agencies. Today we're going to be looking at our last learning target for this unit, which is to identify the goals of the New Deal. So we're going to start by doing a little bit of review while we are thinking about what do we actually need to fix when we're talking about fixing the Great Depression. So we looked last week at how our GDP, gross domestic product or gross national product, is declining, right? How unemployment was way up and how the stock market crashed. One of the things that we didn't get into so much was that the banks failed. So I'm going to give you a little bit more information about that today. 20% of banks failed during this period. So when we're thinking about the causes of the Great Depression, we're looking at that idea, right, that we talked about last week of buying on credit. There's this big gap that is going to widen during this period between the rich and the poor class or the working class. Demand is going up, but wages aren't keeping up. So there's this issue of the gap between the rich and the poor. There's the consumer debt crisis. That's people who have bought on credit, and can't pay it back. We've got an agricultural depression due to the Dust Bowl. There's some trade issues because worldwide there's a downturn in the banks as well. And then we have the banking crisis and the stock market crash. So when the stock market crashed, the market lost half of its value. When the market lost its value, banks also lost money. And I don't know that we necessarily always think about that connection between the economy at large and the banking world, but they're very interconnected. All of the banks are constantly borrowing and lending and trading between each other, and a lot of that runs through the stock market. So banks were also invested in the market. When the crash happened, banks didn't have any money. And I mean that like literally and figuratively. If you went to the bank, they had no cash to give you. Even if your bank account said that you had $1,000 in the bank, guess what? There's no money for you. Which, when we think about like old movies, if you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, which is a sort of Christmas movie, it actually shows the impacts of a bank run really well. A bank run is when people show up, they don't have faith in the bank, and they pull their money out. And then the bank has nothing to lend. Because it's not like Harry Potter and you have a vault in Gringotts, and that's where all of your dollars live. All of our dollars are shared throughout the banking industry. Now that money is insured, and we'll actually talk a little bit about that today. So the guy who was president at the time, his name is Hoover, and he tries, but the people have just totally lost faith in him. So in 1932, we have a new election, and if you take a look at this electoral college map, Hoover, when he was elected in 1928, he's the red. He did very well. He carried, obviously, most of the United States. And when FDR is running in 1932, he's the blue, and you can see that he carries almost the entirety of the United States. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I know you guys get mad when I say Roosevelt, so Roosevelt. He was part of kind of the upper crust of American society. He was born into a wealthy family based out of New York. He's a distant cousin to Theodore Roosevelt. They are related. They're not brothers. They're distant cousins. His experience, he had pretty varied experience in politics. I mean, he was born into this upper crust kind of life. He was well educated. He became Secretary of the Navy and was a vice presidential candidate. He took a leave from the world of politics after he was paralyzed from polio. Polio is an illness that used to be fairly common, mostly in children, and it causes paralysis. And so he was paralyzed by polio. He spent the rest of his life, to some degree, limited in mobility. One of the really interesting things, I think, especially in light of today's social media world and the way that we look at politics today, is most people didn't know that he was wheelchair bound. And the media basically said that they wouldn't report about it and they wouldn't talk about it. So he goes from being kind of on a hiatus from politics to becoming the governor of New York, and then runs for president and is, as you can see, overwhelmingly supported. He is our longest serving president, so we're going to be with FDR for a while. He's going to carry us through almost until the very end of World War II. He is elected 4 times to the presidency. This was before we had a 2-term limit. FDR runs on a platform that within the first 100 days of his administration, he is going to push through as much as possible to try to fix the Great Depression. And his plan to fix the Great Depression is called the New Deal. It's not very well planned. It's a trial and error thing. What's going to work, what's not going to work. And he had a group of advisors. He called them the Brain Trust. So that should tell you that he thought that they were pretty darn smart. And he was able to pretty quickly get people invested in what he was going to do. And in his first inaugural address, he has this very famous quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And thinking about the current climate that we're in, it's hard not to, for me at least, it's hard for me not to think back to FDR and think, okay, we need to work together to get through this. So here are some of the ways that FDR is going to try to address the Great Depression. And the first has to do with the run on banks. The reason why you can feel reasonably confident that your money is going to be there when you go to the bank is he establishes the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which will insure bank deposits. The first time that FDR had what he called his fireside chats was to talk about the banking industry. What FDR did and what he understood about the American people is that they did not feel connected with President Hoover or previous presidents. So he's going to use the new media of radio to reach into people's homes and sit with them and talk to them. So this idea of the fireside chat is that you would tune in on the radio and you would feel like the president was talking directly to you here in your living room. The next step that FDR is going to take is to create the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And what they're going to do is they're going to take federal money and they're going to give that money to the states and to local governments for them to decide how to use it. So it isn't going to be the federal government determining what that money is going to be used for. It is going to provide for the unemployed, but it's really up to the local governments. And that, again, is going to make people feel really connected to what the president is doing. They feel like it's personal and local, and that's all stuff that makes people really feel secure. The next is part of the Public Works Administration. And what this did was take federal money and use it to fund labor and projects that were for the public good. So many of our parks, pieces of infrastructure came out of the Public Works Administration. They built bridges and outdoor concert venues that you see here, bridges, different things that would enhance public life, the general welfare of the people, but would also employ regular people to do it. So the goal was to take those people who are unemployed, and instead of paying them, just giving them money the way that we think of today, unemployment insurance, taking that money, instead you're putting people to work, which makes people feel connected to their community, and you're actually making an impact in your local community. So the Public Works Administration was a great way to get especially young men back into the workforce and making an improvement in their local community. The next is the National Industrial Recovery Act, which is also the National Recovery Administration. And we call this the NIRA or the NRA. Note, this is not the NRA like the National Rifle Association. Different group, unrelated, just happen to have the same letters. So if you write in your essay that you're going to work on for me about the National Rifle Administration, I'll know that you did not listen to my lecture. They are going to step in to try to help businesses. So we've been talking about helping workers, helping communities. Here we're going to try to help business. The ways that the NIRA is going to try to help businesses is they have the opportunity to voluntarily join and become members of this organization that would set wage and price controls. So these are things that are helpful to businesses. It is going to be brought down by the Supreme Court. It's going to be ruled to be unconstitutional before the time that it was used. Again, it made people feel connected to local businesses. The next is called the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And by now you're figuring out that there's a lot of letters. The Agricultural Adjustment Act is going to help farmers. So we've worked through helping communities, helping businesses. Here we're going to try to help farms. Farms are particularly hard hit, not just economically, but environmentally because of the Dust Bowl, which I'll talk a little bit more about. What the federal government did is they subsidized or they paid farmers to make less food. And they would buy and destroy farm products, which is hard to understand. The government is going to step in to regulate prices in the agricultural industry. So we've looked at communities, businesses, and farmers. I want to look particularly at the impact of the Great Depression on young men. They were the most likely to be laid off. The New Deal took specific steps to try to help these young men to feel connected. If there were not enough public works jobs, they still had other opportunities. And the main one would be the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. Again, letters. It employed mostly young men, and they worked on conservation projects. They lived in camps. They lived in community. It's like being at summer camp all the time, and they worked outside. So they taught these men how to work with their hands, a lot of fire breaks and different kind of trails that we would think of that are in parks today came out of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Most of these men, they obviously, room and board was included in their wages, so they mostly sent money home. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a really effective program. It created benefits for the common good. It helped family units, and then it employed these young men. The last of the alphabet soups that we're going to look at is called the Tennessee Valley Authority. It seems like it wouldn't be that important to people in Minnesota to understand, but it has a wide-reaching impact. Federal intervention across state lines to help states do better. So it's a federal experiment, and it includes building dams, bringing electricity into these areas, using the dams for flood control, but also to make more areas fertile for farming. A lot of federal money to benefit these local communities. So they're going to build power plants and chemical plants and dams. And they're going to do all of this to try to, increase the general welfare of the people who are living in this area. Now, you would think with all of these benefits for communities and young people and business and farming and banking that people would have felt really positively about the New Deal. Conservatives who felt like the New Deal was using too much government power or too much intervention were opposed to the New Deal. And liberals who felt like the government wasn't doing enough and wasn't being proactive enough, they opposed the New Deal as well. So it wasn't always that popular, even though it was very effective. The second New Deal. So once the first New Deal has seen some success, FDR is going to put together another block of legislation to continue on. So the Works Progress Administration, massive public works spending, it employs 3 million people a year. They're working on infrastructure, they're building roads, they're building bridges. But not everyone is skilled in that way. So they're also going to use that money to fund the arts. The next is one that we still have today. It's the Social Security Act. We now have the Social Security Administration. And what it did was offer pensions, meaning monthly payments, to people who are old. That cutoff was 65. Also offered unemployment insurance, which is a little bit out of your paycheck, goes to the government, and if you're unemployed, that money comes back to you. You don't make as much. Disability insurance if you're hurt and you can't work. And then dependent children as well. It provided for people of a certain age who might not be getting a pension or getting retirement the way that we think of retirement now. You can't make everyone happy. FDR, people loved him, but you can't make everybody happy. Labor and labor unions are going to gain power. One of the ways they do that is through what's called the Wagner Act, which guaranteed the right of workers to organize unions and use collective bargaining. And we see that across industries, from teachers to the NFL. There are collective bargaining units. So the idea that there's strength in numbers, and when we work together, we can enact change. And so the labor side is going to gain power. A union group called the CIO, and they're going to start using more aggressive tactics. The auto industry is particularly susceptible. The Ford Motor Company and General Motors both had major strikes during this time. And so there's a sit-down strike in Michigan in 1936. I really like this picture because you can see that the men are literally sitting down on the job and they're reading the newspaper. So it makes the idea of a sit-down strike very clear. Last week, you guys looked at some information about the Dust Bowl. Which was a severe drought that caused the topsoil, which had been over-farmed, to lift and blow away, creating these massive dust storms in an economic and ecological disaster. You can see just this wall of sandy, silty soil. And in the Ed puzzle from last week, it talked about how at times these clouds were 200 miles in size. And here's how deep they could get. Here's a car that's almost entirely covered. Again, here's this wall. It results in a mass migration. They're called the Okies, people from Oklahoma who moved. And it's 355,000 people from Oklahoma are going to relocate to California. So even amid this ecological disaster, we have a whole population that's going to shift and change. Somewhat of a myth of the third New Deal, which didn't truly happen. The last part would be the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that's where many of the working conditions that we're used to today come out of. It's the first minimum wage, and it also creates a mandatory 40-hour work week. Is that the minimum wage keeps up with the cost of living, and everything, again, regulates itself. And that's Keynesian economics, letting the market run itself. It's a hands-off approach. And just let the market do what it needs to do. Most Americans opposed having another New Deal. By this point, they feel that the tide has turned, the Depression is ending, and they're ready to start to kind of get things back to the way that they used to be. By 1939, FDR is distracted by the events going on in Europe, and so we're going to leave the Great Depression after we finish our assessment tomorrow and we're going to be right on into World War II. So what are the long-term significances of the New Deal? The first is the creation of these safety net programs, or the welfare state. Programs that are meant to ensure the general welfare, the general well-being of the people. That's things like food stamps, creating the Social Security Administration, unemployment insurance, all of that stuff. The next is increased power in the federal government. FDR is going to use the power of the presidency in a way that was totally unprecedented, and he's going to far overreach what many people would see as being the appropriate powers of the president. The next is a major shift from the way that government was interacting with business during the progressive era, reform, right? And the way that the government is now interacting in a much more direct way. It's going to increase the power of the presidency, and the power of the presidency is going to continue to increase. The power of the presidency is going to continue to increase, and the way that our government functions will never be the same as it was before the New Deal. Whether you think that that's good or that's bad, that's totally up to you. Whether you think that the American welfare state is good or bad is totally up to you. I'm just here to tell you what the goals of the New Deal were. I want you to go back through these slides and make sure that you're able to answer these questions. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day.